Well, that's essentially the focus of the book. People told me that when they lost their jobs, their identities were threatened, and this came in many forms. When their identities were threatened, they experienced things like depression, anxiety, anger, lowered self-esteem, and they felt that they needed to try to do something about that. Some of them could, some of them couldn't. So there were 3 identity threats that came up from participants. They told me that essentially there were mismatches in their identity. And in sociology, we call these identity discrepancies, but you can think of them as mismatches between one aspect of your identity and another. There were 3 that they described. One was called a feedback mismatch, one was a time mismatch, and one was a status mismatch. So with feedback mismatches, the identity that the person holds, the person they believe they are, doesn't match some kind of feedback, some kind of message they're getting from other people. With the time mismatch, this is essentially just not feeling like you're the same person you used to be. So if you lose your job, you don't have it anymore, you may just feel like you've changed. And that feeling of just not being the same person across time was really distressing to a lot of individuals. In the third mismatch, status mismatch, this is a little bit more complicated. It involves a role, so something like employee or parent or what have you, some role that doesn't match an aspect of your status. And when we're talking about status, we mean things like gender, we mean race, age, etc. As far as the population at large, it had widespread effects. Baby boomers lost 1/3 of the value of their retirement accounts during the recession, forestalling retirement for many people. Homes, the value of homes, which is where most of us have our wealth, collapsed in half. They went to half their value. And households overall lost 1/4 of their wealth. One of the most significant things that was different about the Great Recession from previous recessions, too, was that the long-term unemployment was much higher than it had been previously. The average duration of unemployment during the Great Recession was 5 months. I think older and younger people were affected differently by the Great Recession. Older people, of course, were struggling to retire because of the effect on their retirement accounts. They also had a longer duration of unemployment. They would take longer to find work after they'd lost their jobs than did younger people. But younger people struggled as well. I mean, many of these youth were trying to find their first full-time career-oriented job and just couldn't get their footing to get started. If you have an identity-related problem, if identity is causing your mental health problems, you need an identity-based solution. And this is what a lot of work to date has actually ignored. That identity in its own right, besides financial problems, etc., can cause mental health problems. And participants talked about 2 strategies. They talked about what I call shifting and what I call sustaining. If they couldn't do either of these, they tended to fall into what I call identity void, a loss of all sense of self, and were extremely distressed, had extreme depression, or were extremely anxious. Shifting involves moving your identity focus from your worker role to another role, such as parent or coach, etc. And keep in mind, we have lots and lots of identities. We don't have just one identity, we have many. and many of them connect to our roles in society. Sustaining is continuing to identify as an employee even though you know that you're unemployed. And it may at first sound like sort of a self-delusional type strategy, but it's not. These people were very forthcoming about knowing that they were in fact unemployed. They knew what the reality was, but they just fooled themselves a little bit. Sometimes that can actually be good in the short term for our mental health.